And there are so many questions here. My goodness. Someone says you shouldn't have a favorite dog, which is true. You shouldn't. But there we go. And just out of interest, it's a good question, because you list your sources in the back, and someone says that we have a lot to learn perhaps from the Stoics, and wonders if you have a recommendation of more where you can go in further in search of that philosophy.
Yeah, well, at the back of the Happy book, there were loads and loads of book recommendations. I kept everything out of the smaller one just to keep it smaller. I'd say a really good starting point is a book by William Irvine, Irvine, called, I think it's called A Guide to the Good Life, and then The Ancient Art of Stoic Joy, or something like that. That's a really nice introduction by a very nice man. To Stoicism. It's actually a very accessible, it basically is a lot of it's in letters that were written, a lot of it is in teachings that were sort of noted down. It's a very, strangely, that whole world of Greek and into Roman philosophy is an oddly, unexpectedly accessible area and an easy area to read and explore. So yeah, I'd start with that, A Guide to the Good Life, I think it's called.
I think this is a very good question from Lee, who says, thanks for doing this. And how do you deal with feeling like your time is running out? Which I'm sure a lot of people, of many ages feel that you've missed opportunities in the past, the woulda, shoulda, coulda mindset.
God, that's depressing. As I approach 50. No, I think the key is there is there's a shift that should happen as you go into that sort of middle passage of life. And if you don't honor it, that's where this whole midlife crisis thing comes from. So if the first half of life is slaying the dragon, the second half is about rescuing the princess, right? Which would normally follow. So that's why these stories have some sort of psychological resonance. So the first half is about slaying your dragons. You're going out in the world, you're staking your claim, you are kind of saying, this is me, and you're finding out who you are. And the relationship, the key relationship there is between your ego and the world. And then something happens for the second half of life where you're rescuing the princess. You're serving something maybe that's bigger than you. You're finding your task. You're kind of, you're shifting your priority. And if there's the change now is it becomes more between the ego and the self, which is a little bit more about finding out who were you supposed to be before all this stuff in the world kind of got in the way and messed up the project. What actually was the kind of authentic thing you were supposed to be doing with your life? And normally that's about serving something bigger. So we find meaning in life by finding something bigger than ourselves and throwing ourselves into that thing, right? Whatever that is. So all this may sound nonsense if you're in your 20s, but as you get into the second half of life, these kind of things do become more important. If you're still kind of ambitious and trying to kind of claim stake your claim in the world in your 60s, then you've slightly missed things. I think so. That's the answer. Is you allow priorities to shift, and I feel like I'm very much sort of on the cusp of all that at the moment. I've tried to do it with my own sort of work and my own interests. And you just lean into other things and find a different sort of meaning.
And we touched on this, but somebody asks: Is the central takeaway from the book everything you cannot control is satisfactory?
Well, it's not like it's everything you can't control is sort of ideal. And the Stoics, I don't really quite consider myself a Stoic, I should say, but I don't think any one philosophy holds the answer to anything. But they would just they would suggest a kind of indifference, like a sort of non-attachment. Bear in mind, the first Stoics were from the East, so it's a sort of, it takes in a lot of Buddhist ideas as well. So it's a form of non-attachment to these things that are out of your control. So it's not so much about they're great, but maybe satisfactory is a good word. But you're sort of fostering a kind of indifference to those things that are out of your control. This is all about bringing your center of gravity inside. That's sort of the aim here. You're bringing it back in here and not putting your center of gravity out in things that you don't have control over, like what other people think of you, right? In terms of, fame and reputation and so on. You're bringing it inside. So it's about having a more robust sense of self. So hasn't got a lot to say about the value of kindness and the value of, this sense of how much we share with others and these things that join us up and so on, as I was talking about. So there are sort of edges to it, and I think there are other thoughts that are valuable alongside it. But it's a really good model for just developing a kind of a more robust starting point to take out into the world.
It's incredibly hard, isn't it, to not care what people think of you? It's a great idea, but on earth to do that.
It's incredibly hard if you decide that has to be the sort of, you have to do that perfectly, but it's not incredibly hard to have it as a thing to lean into. And I think that's what all this is about. The Stoics sort of had their sage. So it's like a semi-fictional idea of the sage, the kind of the wise Stoic that would do all this stuff perfectly, but you're just kind of where you can, learning from that, leaning into it, and kind of adopting it where you can. And I think you just start in really small ways. You start in small ways. How is it fine if that person thinks that? Oh, of course it's fine. People can think what they like. I could think of, a shark coming into this room now and swimming around and eating up my book. I can think what I like. People can think what they like. It's just stuff in their head. So you can start with just small stuff, and maybe it works for you, maybe it doesn't, but it can grow and become more part of you as you kind of reap the benefits, which is just, as I said, this sort of sense of gravity in there. So yeah, it's hard if you just take it as one huge big thing. And also, you wouldn't want to be like that all the time. You don't really want to go through life not caring what people think anyway. I don't think I'm like that. I like people to like me, so I know I'm not like that, but I do know that it's really helpful in times when we're faced with it and we need a way of dealing with a problem. Then it's certainly it's a really helpful approach.
Ian's question was one that was on my list, and you sort of covered it, but I think he makes a point, which is about, I agree, he says, with your ideas about Stoicism, and that we should focus on what we can control. And I was thinking all the way through the book, particularly of climate change. Where does that leave us when it comes to a problem like climate change? Things we need to act together to change. It's the one that really comes to mind when you think of things that are out of your control, that we can't just let go.
Yes, exactly. Well, the Stoic answer there would be, again, just separating outcome from intention, and what that can do is it can just take out. I mean, there's always a place for anger. It doesn't in any kind of movement, but it doesn't always. You need to at some point transition from anger into sort of practical, measures, and you need to get away from just being angry, because that tends to get in the way. So that's what tends to happen if you separate the outcome from your intention. As with any kind of movements, I think that's going to be important. You're focusing on what you can do to actually make something change. So the Stoic thing, I think, still holds up there. I think more of the problem, and a more helpful thing. I mean, there's a few issues why I think it's doesn't stick for some people. Things move so slowly. The problem builds so slowly that we don't quite see it. And we can feel nagged, which is another thing that turns some people off. But the people that have, it's like the happiness thing. The environment is so easily becomes something separate from us. It becomes like this sort of noun that's out there. And the moment you see the environment as something that's sort of out there and separate from you, we can disconnect from it. And of course, it isn't. The environment, it's the air that I'm breathing as I'm talking. It's like it is very much here. And if you start to see the environment as something that is active, and again, a kind of a verb, like I was saying at the beginning, and you focus on the activity of it, then suddenly you realize the importance of, you start to see the insects and their activity, and the soil's silent toil, and the movement and its relevance to us. And there was a point when we had a much more embodied relationship with the environment. Over the last couple of thousand years, that's moved. We've separated ourselves because our ideas of truth have become sort of somehow bodiless. They've become quite sort of arid and cerebral, and all that has cut us off from an embodied relationship with our environment. There's a great book called The Spell of the Sensuous by David Abram, which is a really great deep dive into all of that. So again, you've got that problem of it's not this kind of noun. When we package things up neatly as nouns, we kind of move them to arm's length. And we need to unpack those nouns again and think of them more as living, active verbs that actually affect us and are complex, and we're involved in a dialogue with, and all that does get missed. So I think that's something just to lean into.
Ben says he'd love to hear what you think about workplace wants, i.e. promotions and raises. How do you frame control over the situation when other people are involved, such as managers?
Again, it's just you separate. It's a tricky thing to pull apart, but the idea is reassuringly simple. You separate what you're actually in control of, what you're putting out, from the results. There's a really good, if you go onto YouTube, there's a great talk in which Bryan Cranston, as in from Breaking Bad, good name of the show. Bryan Cranston talks about it in terms of auditions and saying that, and it's a Stoic principle. I don't know if he thinks of it as that, but he realized that his job in an audition is not to get the job. His job is to go in and present the character in a compelling way and so on, and do the best thing he can. But to actually get the work, to get given the job, is not his job. And bear in mind, this is like a big source of classic anxiety for actors, is dealing with auditions and the constant rejection. If someone else gets the job, now he just thinks, well, that was theirs. It's like you said, it's like finding a wallet on the floor and it's yours. Like there's no sense of ownership. There's no sense of like, that was supposed to be mine. It's just, that was yours. He says, and this isn't just something he can, the luxury of doing because he's successful. This idea came before, and he says he's never worked as much since changing to that philosophy, that the stuff that's not out of his control, whether you get the job, is not your problem. That's not your task. Your task is just to do your bit in a compelling way. So your talent and your energy, what you're putting out there, it really does hold up. And look, sometimes these things are difficult. It's really hard to pick those things apart, but it is worth knowing that idea holds up. It always holds up. Sometimes you've just got to pick apart, what am I in control of and what am I not? But you can emotionally aim to separate yourself from the stuff that isn't. You cannot control what other people do, but you can control what you put out there. And that's always the key. And if you don't, you get when you get caught up in trying to change other people and so on, then you get into all sorts of problems, and you create anxiety and you create bitterness and jealousy and all sorts of stuff like that. They're not going to help you. They're only going to make things worse.
But Thomas then says, what if what is making you unhappy is the unhappiness of someone you feel responsible for, such as your child? How do you come to think, I can't control that, it's fine?
Yeah, well, that's a really good example, I think, of where the Stoic thing slightly kind of hits a bit of an edge. I don't think it's the best model for that. I think nurturing, and particularly with children, I don't really think that Stoicism holds up. It would be a very strange approach there. So I think there are very, very few exceptions, and I think that's one of them, and it's well spotted. But it's also because your sense of self there is shifting. Your sense of self is shifting because it's active, right? To include this other being, especially if it's a being that you brought into the world. So in a sense, it's not so much contradicting the Stoicism thing. It's still based on the idea that you're moving your center of gravity in to protect your sense of self and make it robust. You're now just including this other being in that sense of self. So I think that's what's going on there. So I think in a weird way it still kind of holds up. But yeah, I think it probably isn't the best language to use in that sort of situation for that reason.
Another really interesting question is, how do we balance following what we enjoy, and they say jumping from lily pad to lily pad, as you said, with meeting societal expectations? So if you want your work to play to your strengths, but the business or your boss expects something else and tries to push you down a route, and there are obviously, of course, so many ways in which that applies, that what makes you happy and is not necessarily what society expects of you, and that's a great sort of pull for some people, a sort of.
Yeah, of course. Well, I think look, there are two things. First of all, what the big thing is, that's what the whole point of this is. The whole point is to go, this is a kind of a pull and push in these two different directions, And if you go back to that idea of the graph, here are your aims, here are the things you want to be doing, here's all the stuff that life is throwing back at you, or demands that are being made on you. And we live an X equals Y diagonal, right? So it's sort of a meandering line maybe across that diagonal. So sometimes we're on top, things are as we want them, and sometimes life is in control. So the big thing is to make peace with that line, to understand, well, that is what life is. It doesn't mean I'm failing sometimes because things aren't going the way that I want. So making peace with that, as opposed to buying into this model that everything should be going the way you want it to, that's a big thing. The whole point of picking the things apart and going, what do I actually want to kind of emotionally commit myself to? Well, that's what you're doing. Here are these various things pulling in a way, pulling one direction to the other. So you're going to try and give yourself a bit of clarity by separating. And when you do make that separation, but those things are still pressing, like that's kind of okay. But you're just, it's just where you're sort of putting your heart, where you're putting your emotional commitment. You're just detaching it from the things that are not under your control. But you can also pretend to be more bothered by those things than you are. I mean, this is important in relationships. I think I do kind of like have quite a stoic approach to things that would otherwise cause anxiety. I tend to sort of not really get anxious about stuff. My partner does, but I've noted that if I sort of move into a kind of reassurance mode and, you know, sort of tell him that, oh, it's fine because of X, Y, Z, it doesn't have to bother you, it just makes him more angry, right? Because it's actually not, it's not always quite, sometimes you need to play the game a little more because the rest of the world isn't quite operating like that. So that's also, I think, of value. It's okay. It's not like we don't have to engage with those demands that are being made, but we don't have to emotionally embroil ourselves in them in the way that we would otherwise. So it's just finding a little bit of clarity. And sometimes it's clearer than others. And when we find those points when we can go, oh yes, I see, I get it, that really makes sense. And now I do actually feel differently about that. Once we get that, once you start to sort of get that into your system a bit, it becomes easier to apply in other areas that are a bit more murky. But it does work.
And a really good question, and we might have to end with this. There are so many, but I think we've answered, broad themes of many of them. But somebody says, and I think I'm sure applies to very many people, which is that I'm going through a period in my life where I seem to be suffering with health anxiety. I expect many are with the COVID situation. And whether you could elaborate or explain how one can deal with and cope with health anxiety.
I may not be the right person to do that. That
really feels like a lot of what you're talking about. Yeah. It's the absolute epitome of sort of things you can't control, worrying very much about what you can't control.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it is. And I think even if you there are plenty of people, particularly at the start of lockdown, that were saying, felt like they're having a great lockdown and they really welcomed it and it's, no problem at all. But even then, even for those people, I kind of include myself in this, that anxiety finds ways of getting in. Even if you're kind of okay, your partner may not be. And that then feeds into this sort of relationship and can create problems and anxieties in a kind of secondary way. So it's there for all of us in one form or another, whether it's directly related to health or not. I still think that those two broad thoughts do hold. One is finding ways of separating your own tasks from what's going on in the world and kind of getting on with your own stuff and keeping your commitment, your emotional commitment there, and deciding that everything on the outside you're just going to kind of roll with it. That has to minimize anxiety. And the other thought, which is sort of the opposite thought, if it works more for you, is this feeling that it's all stuff that is being shared at the moment, that it isn't an isolated experience. There's a difference between a kind of sense of sadness, for example, and melancholy, right? Sadness when things go badly and we tend to turn it in and feel that we've failed, and we get into, as anxiety is, a kind of self-perpetuating cycle. There's a difference between that, if you think of as sadness, versus melancholy, which is kind of going, the world and life. There's something in the structure of life that is tragic at some level. You know, the Greeks knew this, and you know, we've had it with us a long time. You can't deny that. And you can lean into that, and then that becomes something that we all share. And there's a sort of a note of melancholy that's perfectly appropriate to feel in life. And if we try to banish that because we think we're supposed to be happy all the time, and the optimistic model and so on, then that's gonna create problems for us, because it just isn't realistic. So leaning into that shared experience, I think, is also very very helpful. For me, those are the two big most helpful thoughts in a world that's kind of going mad. It's finding robustness here, and then it's going, well, you can't do that. This is at least a shared thing, and there's something really, I think, beautiful about that. I've really felt it, like as the lockdown has sort of lifted and people have started to connect again. There's a real sense of an unusually human thing of reconnecting with people that have been through the same thing, or have lost people too, or have been through this extraordinary kind of strange adventure. That's a really wonderful thing. We don't very often get that played out quite as literally as we are now. So I don't know. Beyond that, the details of an individual's anxiety is really hard to say. But I hope you find something in either or both of those thoughts. But it is a perfectly understandable and rational and logical approach, response to what's happening. And you certainly don't need to make it worse by feeling that you're you must be going mad. It isn't. It's a very, very logical response.
I think lots of people feel very similar. Do you have time for one more question, Derren?
Of course, yeah, as long as you like, yeah.
So somebody asked whether, and it's important, I think, this, whether your thoughts on how this all extends to dealing with addiction. They say to food, for example. You talk about smoking in the book.
I think, okay, well, in terms of well, smoking is actually quite a good one. I don't know if this is a particularly Stoic thing. Maybe it is, maybe, but if you, yeah, I'm trying to pin it back to the Stoics. It's hard, but what we, again, look, if we aim for perfection, that's where these things go wrong. So classically, you give up smoking, works great for a few months, and then you have a really stressful time, or you go on holiday, or something happens and you have one and you think, well, it's fine, I'll just have one. And then you start to feel like you failed because you had one. And then gradually, it comes back. It's a very common story. Fine for a few months, then you have one, and then it all goes to pot because you failed. But perfection should never be the point. It should just be about tenacity. So actually, just keeping going, right? Keeping going with the project. So if you have one after 3 months because you've had a bad day, that's great, because you were having 15 a day before. Now you've had one in 3 months, and maybe in 3 months' time you'll have another one. Maybe in 6 months' time you'll have another. Maybe in another year you'll have another one. Like that's a story of continuing success. And the difference there is just the narrative, isn't it? Between, wow, I've had one in 3 months, I'm doing amazingly, versus, oh, I've failed, so now I'm just going to go back to smoking. The key is always to see yourself as a non-smoker, as opposed to just to try not to do something. If you're trying not to do something, all you're doing is putting that thought there and then trying to see past it. And it just doesn't work, or at least it's a very hard way of doing it. The people that just stop like that, the people that just give up these things, are the ones that have a very clear image for themselves of what they want to be, and then they just sort of step into that. So it's worth doing that, to take a moment to build up an image of yourself. A self-image is literally just a picture we carry around with ourselves of who we are, right? That we go to. Most of our pictures are terrible because we've never taken a moment to sort of consciously put them together. So they're just a pile of every insecurity we can imagine. Whereas if you can take a moment to actually build a good one, particularly if if it's a specific thing like wanting to stop smoking. So just think about it, like sit down and close your eyes for a bit and just picture what that would be, what it would look like and feel like, and then you make the picture really bright and vivid and colorful and all the things that we do when we picture things that we're excited by, and step into it, and think what it would sort of feel like to be in that, and just have something that's very clear and tangible and is easy to step into and know what you want to be and want to be like. And then it won't matter if you do have one after 3 months, because that you can still continue to be that. It's just a different kind of story and a different approach. And I think that works. I don't think it's a particularly Stoic thing or ties in with much of what we're talking about today, but it's how people give up when they can do it quickly. Honestly,
I reluctantly am going to have to sort of draw it to a close, but hopefully you'll come back. Like, would maybe do a similar event with you soon. I know there are so many questions we could go on all evening, but
I'd love to.
Thank you so very much for joining us, and thank you to all of you for tuning in your hundreds. It's wonderful that you have. Thank you very, very much.
Yeah, thank you all of you that stuck around. There's still 516 of you, which is amazing. Thank you for sticking around. Lots of love.